And it's great to be here. And I know some of you in the room, so it's really neat to be have this opportunity to talk to you. And Peter asked me to talk about both the work in Malawi as well as the IPCC. So I'm going to have a sort of a presentation split in two, and the first half will be the IPCC sort of global view of climate change in the food system, and the second half will be on the agro-ecosystem diversification. So just having greater diversification of animals and plants in the landscape can be very effective, and this is quite robust, the literature in this. So having a greater number of crops grown across the landscape, more integration of animals and plants in the landscape can be really effective. And then agroecology, which is the approach that I take in my work in Malawi, is another strategy for really enhancing adaptation benefits. And it's not only in terms of reducing climate risk, but these strategies often have other benefits like livelihood improvement, health and well-being. So things like having urban green spaces that produce food that can also allow for social networks and provide some locally available diverse foods for low-income communities, but can also reduce heat stress and reduce the kind of impact of these kind of heat islands in urban areas that often have very little green space. That's one example where you get multiple benefits from an adaptation strategy. So I mentioned this already, sort of ecosystem-based adaptation approaches. There's really strong literature in this area showing the many benefits that these can provide, and really thinking about not just a sort of technical fix, but this broader holistic approach to adaptation in food systems that takes into account ecosystems and biodiversity. So I mentioned agroecosystem diversification, and so this, is a whole host of different strategies that would vary by place, but one might be where you have these rows of different crops. You might have flower strips, you might have hedgerows, and agroforestry, and these increase diversification across the landscape, which is quite different from how much of food is produced in North America, but it provides, things like water, increased water storage and regulation, pollination opportunity, improved soil fertility, and reduced risk of impacts from temperature extremes. So overall, greater yield stability. And there's been a meta review showing that you would have the same or improved yields compared to just relying on monocropping of one crop across a landscape. So for example, one study in Canada found that if you had corn rotations with a diversified cropping system, you had positive yield impacts, yield stability, and increased soil organic matter under different scenarios of climate change compared to corn monocropping. So this is not just an option for a place like Malawi, but also for the United States. And another interesting thing of the report that caused a lot of controversy when we got to the improvement process was this evidence of maladaptation. So increasingly in the literature, there's evidence that if you do adaptation badly, you can have many negative impacts. So really thinking about how you're doing adaptation, so who's involved, where it's being undertaken, and paying attention to the risks that adaptation strategy might have for the ecosystem or for the people where it's being undertaken is really crucial to avoid either increasing greenhouse gas emissions, increasing inequity, or degrading ecosystems. So one example in the food system is irrigation, which is often done as an adaptation strategy, but if it's done poorly, can lead to increased salinization. It can lead to increased inequity between producers, with large-scale producers often benefiting and smallholder producers leading to the risk of failing and they're losing their livelihoods. It can also lead to groundwater depletion, which can affect the availability of water for everyday citizens. So this is an important factor to take into account. So basically, there's a lot of messages for policymakers about thinking about what they're doing when they're undertaking adaptation in a more holistic way. And we looked as well at the literature around agricultural intensification, which is also often done in the name of adaptation and in the name of reducing climate risk for food security. And this can have many negative impacts, including displacing local producers and worsening their food security and livelihoods, but also many ecosystem impacts if it's in terms of biodiversity and in terms of water pollution, salinization, and other factors. So I'd mentioned this climate resilient development pathways was an overall sort of framework that has been put forward previously, but was enhanced in this report. The importance of thinking about the interactions between ecosystems and human health and well-being, and thinking about sort of social justice dimensions of adaptation and ecosystems as really crucial for ensuring we have sort of long-term resilient systems. And really addressing social inequities as a key dimension of adaptation. So thinking about who is marginalized in society already, and how can we change that in order to bolster resilience overall. Farm workers were one group, for example, who are at greater risk from climate change impacts, whether it's heat stress, whether it's wildfires, whether it's food insecurity. And so thinking about how adaptation strategies take those marginalized groups into account is really crucial. And having these multi-sectoral solutions that address social inequities. So, for example, strategies that support smallholder farmers in building their resilience, but finding ways to get their diversified foodstuffs into the local food system through things like public procurement in school programs or in hospitals, so that they have a livelihood source if they're growing more diversified crops as a means of being more resilient in terms of their land base. And we found a lot of gaps in adaptation research, but I want to make sure I have enough time for questions. So I want to jump. So we've jumped from the global picture, and now I'm going to move to the local picture. The local picture being Malawi and Tanzania, where I've done research for the last over 20 years. And the most common strategy for climate change adaptation in Africa more broadly is what's called sustainable intensification. So this is a combination of usually use of synthetic fertilizer, hybrid seeds, and sort of expert-driven strategies that don't really address questions of political or social inequities. And I mentioned that the work that I've done has really focused on an alternative, which is agroecology. And some of you may not be familiar with that term. Agroecology is both a science of kind of bringing together agronomy and ecology and how we produce food, but it also is a more holistic approach to thinking about the social, political, and social, political, and economic dimensions of the food system. And so it's often thought of as both a science, a set of practices, and social movements. And in 2019, I was part of a UN panel that wrote a report on agroecology and its potential to address food security and nutrition. And we went through the literature and identified sort of 13 principles that underlie agroecology, and some of these are at the field level, so things like recycling, finding synergies between plants and animals in your farming system, reducing reliance on toxic and fossil fuel-based inputs, enhancing biodiversity. But a lot of agroecology is at the kind of farm, or at the beyond the farm level. So thinking about doing research that brings in indigenous and local knowledge, ensuring participation in the food system, sort of democratization of the food system, addressing questions of equity and fairness, ensuring that the food system produces foods that are culturally appropriate and reflect local values, cultural values, and having diversification of the food system so that you can have local and regional food enterprises that benefit from food production, and building greater connectivity between consumers and producers. So the literature really points to agroecology and agrobiodiversity in particular as having these benefits in terms of climate change adaptation. And I'd mentioned this already from the IPCC report. So because agroecology as a key principle is increasing biodiversity in the food system, and this leads to many benefits in terms of climate change adaptation, as well as these other benefits for improving food security and providing fodder for livestock and so on. And at the heart really of agroecology is this involving farmers and food producers in crafting of the way food is produced, and doing research that really brings their knowledge to the forefront, and addressing inequities in the food system. So it's not just a set of practices, but really addressing kind of power inequities in the food system. And that's how it differentiates from other approaches like sustainable intensification or climate smart practices. So we looked at the literature for whether agroecology can improve. This is as part of the UN author team that I was involved in. And we found that there is strong evidence that agroecology can improve food security and nutrition. And the more complex the system is, so not just intercropping or adding more crops to a field, but actually doing farmer-to-farmer training or addressing some of the social inequities in the food system, it's more likely to have positive food security and nutrition outcomes. So that's kind of a overarching picture of agroecology if you weren't familiar with it. And now I'm going to just highlight some of the research I've been involved in Malawi and Tanzania, where we've looked at this and actually tested it with farmers, the potential for agroecology to improve not only food security, but sustainable land management and livelihoods and nutrition in smallholder households. And I've led a number of studies addressing this question, one with 400 households, where the households were selected because they were highly food insecure in northern and central Malawi. One with 6,000 households that came later, where we were kind of scaling out this farmer-to-farmer training and testing agroecology at a larger scale in northern and central Malawi. And then we had a sort of sister project in Tanzania with almost 600 households, again, comparing control and intervention and before and after to see if this approach could lead to improvements in nutrition, as well as other aspects of smallholder households. And the typical strategies that farmers were using included agroforestry, so growing trees on their farms as well as crops, intercropping different types of nitrogen fixing edible legumes such as pigeon pea and groundnut, using compost, and diversifying crops in general, including some crops that had been sort of forgotten or declined in use, such as sorghum and finger millet. And then a lot of emphasis on farmer-to-farmer learning and farmer exchanges. So farmers meeting monthly, exchanging what they were doing, visiting other places to see what farmers are doing, and so on. And a big piece of what we did as well is incorporate social inequities into our strategy. So developing ways to talk about gender inequity in communities and talk about other social inequities through things like drama and theater that we developed in collaboration with farming communities. And our research indicated that this approach of agroecology significantly improved food security and dietary diversity. And some of the strategies that made a difference in terms of actual practices were things like crop diversity and compost application. So for example, a household was 32% less likely to be severely food insecure per additional food crop grown in one of our studies. And this occurred over a 3-year period. And we found that there were many ways that farmers were increasing their food security. It wasn't just that they were adding more crops and eating more crops, but they were doing things like, because they didn't have to purchase fertilizer, they were able to use that saved because they were using things like compost and intercropping of legumes. They were using that money to invest in animals. They were increasing dry season vegetable gardens. They no longer had to work on other people's farms in order to raise that money to buy fertilizer during the growing season, and that allowed them to do things like better weeding, planting earlier. So they actually were investing their labor differently instead of working on other people's farms for poor wages, which is often what farmers were doing when they were running out of their own food sources in Malawi. They were able to use it more effectively to get better productivity out of their farms. And we also found gender relations are really crucial for seeing these kinds of differences. So if farmers are sharing information between spouses, they were much more likely to be food secure and have diverse diets. And in Tanzania, we did some further measurement and found that farmers who were participating in these peer-to-peer strategies, also women saw a decrease in the likelihood of depression. We measured depression using a standardized measure that was adapted for the Tanzanian context, and found that it was quite high, the likelihood of depression for women at the start of the intervention, and that it decreased. And it decreased both because of improved food security, but also because men were more involved in helping out with household tasks. We also found improvements in dietary diversity and nutrition outcomes, so an increase in diversity of foods that people are consuming, which has positive nutritional outcomes. And we went back a few years later in the project where we worked with 6,000 households to see if they were still using these practices, and found that 90% of those surveyed were still using agroecological practices, and that they had shared their information with, on average, 10 or more other farming households, and in some cases shared their seeds. And we found there were these kind of social benefits as well. So farmers who were using these practices were more likely to build these social networks, and that building those social networks also helped them to increase the number of practices that they were using, which makes sense because they're learning from other people about what is possible. So yeah, just to summarize the kind of approach that is involved, and it is a more complex approach than just, here's a crop you can grow, or here's one practice you can do in terms of farming. It's much more complex in terms of paying attention to how people are learning about information, addressing power inequities in communities, and adapting the practices to the particular context, and then assessing different outcomes over time. So may seem very far from Tompkins County, but I don't think it is, having also worked and volunteered in this region. I think there's some shared things that I can find anyways. So with that, I open it up to questions.
That was great, Rachel. Thanks. Just really respect your ability to take these pretty technical, complex issues and communicate them in a way that we can all understand, which I think is a really vital skill for any scientist engaged in the fields that you are engaged in. As you were talking, I couldn't help but think, I wonder how you got started. At what point did you decide you wanted to be a scientist, and in particular, why do you want to specialize in this particular area?
Yeah, it's a good question. In my undergraduate, I did an undergraduate degree. I mean, it probably started before then, because before I started my undergraduate studies, I traveled in Mexico and Guatemala, and I became very interested in thinking about addressing food insecurity, but also kind of social justice questions. But in the my undergraduate degree, I did in international development studies, and it was an interdisciplinary degree. I had to take soil science. I come from an urban background. I mean, I grew carrots in my home garden, but that's about it for farming. And I loved soil science. I loved it. And then for my undergraduate thesis, I lived in Guatemala for a year and worked with a nonprofit. That was a requirement for our degree. And I worked with smallholders and studying soil conservation methods. And I really loved that. So I think by the time I finished my undergrad, I was thinking maybe this could be interesting to do research alongside farmers. So yeah, it was a required course in soil science, and probably that exposure, opportunity to travel around Mexico and Guatemala and seeing the inequities that really got me started.
Yeah, thanks for that. Really underscored for me, just listening to you now, why it was so important when I was dean and provost, where I really pushed hard on the whole issue of making sure undergrads had the opportunity for overseas study and interdisciplinary study. I can see how that really fed into the work you later took on. So thanks for that. Really interesting question in chat that I want to start with, and I'll turn to Chuck. This comes from Ingrid Zbel, who's a climate scientist at PRI, does a lot of work in this area. She says, yesterday's Supreme Court decision seems likely to put wetlands and therefore people at risk. You've talked about the importance of healthy ecosystems, but we seem to be in a political climate where we may be losing tools like regulations to protect ecosystems. What are the best ways to motivate people and businesses to protect ecosystems if we can't rely so much on regulations?
Such a good question. I guess I think we're all struggling with that. I mean, I don't want to give up on regulation because I think some of the bad actors need that regulation. So I'm also very alarmed at that Supreme Court decision yesterday, because I think it's very troubling for protecting wetlands and seeing the connectivity between wetlands and climate risk and pollution. But I think making the impacts seem relevant to the people that you're trying to motivate is crucial. So whether it's rising food prices, whether it's disruptions, sort of thinking about what I think talking about polluted water may be uninteresting to people unless they themselves have been affected by that. So unfortunately, not talking about necessarily vulnerable groups that are the most affected, but talking about how you will be affected by these impacts unless action is taken, I guess, is the way to motivate if you can't regulate, but not giving up on regulation either and continuing to push for that.
Yeah, I think that's really important, that and that is both an individual and collective activity. But I think it's really our job as citizens in a democratic republic to stay engaged and make sure we participate in electing folks that will represent our values and our views and priorities. And I know that's true for this group of folks. They're very highly motivated. And you can see that, Rachel, if you just sort of look through chat and see where folks are engaged. Chuck.
Peter, I want to thank you for continuing the conversation, the dialogue between climate and food systems. And Rachel clearly is the ideal person to help us see both the macro level, what's going on with IPCC and in her local work. Rachel, thank you for the wonderful overview and actually for your work over the years that makes it possible for you to comment with so much insight. I want to raise a vexing question, at least for me, that I guess might fit into your category of interconnections, which the committee has clearly struggled to do, and I think valiantly. So the vexing question I want to raise is land tenure. And it's been the case that over the last decade, land in excess of the size of France has been transferred from local producers, mostly in the global south, to corporations and investors, mostly in the global north. And I think it's easy to put land tenure aside in a category of its own and not introduce it when we're talking about climate effects and interactions. But it's really plain that when you take land away from local producers at this magnitude, it means that many of the things you so appreciate in Malawi don't get to happen. Those interconnections, the justice issues for women and minorities, for marginalized people, et cetera. So land and water grabbing, as it's often referred to, is a severe problem. It replaces natural forests with oil palm forests, et cetera, et cetera. And my question for you is, when you engage and participate in international panels, has this massive land alienation factor been forgotten? It seems to have spiked in recent years and is now quiet again. Yet it's going on. It's going on in the north and the south. And I worry that many of the interactions and interconnections with climate change that deal with this very human and policy component are sidelined.
Thanks, Chuck. That is such a good question. And I'm proud to say it is in our chapter. You saw the key risk of policy risk, which is in part in reference to the risk of, now we didn't use the term land grab in the report, but land acquisition that is done in the name of climate change adaptation. So we have a section that looks at the literature related to, and we did focus on Indigenous peoples because that's where the scientific literature is the most robust, but looking at the danger of land acquisition done that can lead to worsening outcomes for food systems and worsening outcomes for local and Indigenous peoples in particular. So that is a danger, not only in terms of adaptation, but in terms of mitigation. And so in the report in general, we had a discussion about whether we should have a term mal-mitigation because of that being a danger, land being taken with intent to, invest in alternative fuels, but this leading to displacement of local and Indigenous people and worsening of their livelihoods and nutrition and food security. So that is, and ecosystem impacts as well, if you're talking about monocultures. So we had a section in the summary for policymakers on maladaptation, which tried to draw attention to this kind of risk. which isn't always welcomed by policymakers.
Mhm.
But yes, I think it's difficult to talk about in interdisciplinary spaces and have everyone understand what you're talking about. But it is an ongoing risk, and if not a greater risk, because of the investment opportunities for alternative fuel. So I think it's something to be very concerned about and pay attention to. And that's why, adaptation and mitigation strategies that take marginalized groups and take social justice into account is really crucial to avoid these kinds of worsening impacts for those already marginalized groups.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel.
So, Rachel, only 11,771 articles you reviewed. I don't know how you ever got through that, but and then only 6,000 households in Malawi surveyed. I mean, those are just such big numbers. Did you what kind of assistance did you have in carrying out that kind of research in Malawi in particular?
In Malawi, I've worked with great teams, both Malawian farmers, soil scientists, epidemiologists, geographers, and public health experts, and nonprofit organization. I have a long-term partnership with a nonprofit in Malawi, the Soils, Food, and Healthy Communities organization, and students, undergraduate students and graduate students. But yes, that Malawi Farmer to Farmer Agroecology project was a major undertaking, a lot of work. The IPCC review, it's all volunteers, by the way. We're all volunteers. None of us are paid for that work on the IPCC, just in case you think I'm raking in the cash on the side or something. I think the people often don't realize that for the IPCC. So I was able to hire a graduate student who did help, but mostly it's just it's essentially like a full-time job on the side that you're doing for 3.5 years, and drawing on other authors. We had a lot of contributing authors who would help with that assessment on land acquisition. We reached out to an expert in that field who did one table, but it was a very important table. So drawing on the willingness of scientists to put in the time to do the assessment, it was an enormous undertaking, all during the pandemic. It started before the pandemic, thankfully, so we were able to meet each other before we stayed up all hours of the night on Zoom talking to each other. But yes, it's not for the faint of heart, that work.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the things I also was thinking about listening to your presentation is the contrast that it posed to some of the findings of the Tompkins County food system inquiry. In particular, the statistic that I really retained was the one about the fact that 90% of the agricultural land in Tompkins County is devoted to raising monocultural crops strictly for animals. And obviously runs counter to your research and recommendations. In fact, the contrast couldn't be any starker.
Yes, I just quickly answered that question of Dave's. There's no tractors in I mean, there are tractors for large scale estates, but not the smallholders. It's all hand-hoed agriculture.
Yeah, thanks. And also the other David, as an observation, note that many mainstream U.S. farm organizations have hailed the Supreme Court decision centering the conservative idea of property rights. Yeah, sure. John Locke would be happy about that. And the less ideologically narrow idea that farmers are worthy land stewards without need for regulation. Political economy of the agricultural industry is clearly at play in here, not just in the US.
Mhm.
Dawn, you have your hand up.
Thanks, and thank you, Rachel. It was really good to hear some new information for me, thinking about maladaptation and looking at how you really integrated kind of the socio-cultural aspects within the research. I do have a question related to scale and tipping point. So really early on in the presentation, you said that I think around the world, there are a number of different innovative, more climate-friendly agricultural practices happening, but on small scales. And we know that climate change is this global challenge to agriculture around the world. And then with Malawi and Tanzania, you've got a 6,000 farm research. So on this scale of very local 1 or 2 operations to global, and where your research sits, I'm just wondering if you have any perspective on tipping point that would potentially also affect some of the economic, political issues that we've been talking about as kind of the root cause threats to seeing real change. Yeah, just in terms of if you've seen anything that really starts to shift or pick up momentum in a way that is going to have the kind of extensive impact that we need to see.
Well, I think the rising food prices perhaps is something globally that we've seen in the last year. I mean, this combination of the Ukrainian conflict, the invasion of Ukraine, and companies taking advantage of an opportunity to raise prices. I think that's and combined with climate change impacts, I think that's raised a lot of alarms in many different places in the world. And so perhaps could be, you're a tipping point, but I think that one has to be always trying to be aware of how those things can be taken advantage of too. So in the case of rising food prices, that has been used by sort of input companies, fertilizer companies, and others to promote intensified agriculture as the solution. So sort of more of the same rather than changing the food system to address, climate change impacts. Although I must say in Malawi, because of the rising food prices, rising inflation, and rising fertilizer prices, the government, it does seem there is more of an opening for alternatives to intensified sort of reliance on fossil fuel-based inputs. And there does seem more interest in sort of ecological alternatives. Yes, I work at a smaller scale, but there are approaches like the one I've outlined in Malawi being taken in many different parts of the world. In India, there's an entire state that's undertaking this approach, and as a government really embracing that. Brazil, pre and post Bolsonaro, has really has a agroecology policy and has many policies and practices that support this, in part because of very active social movements. So yeah, I guess for me, from a food system perspective, probably food prices are what really drives people to think about alternatives. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
So Rachel, really interesting question from Aaron Fernando. Can you talk about how theater and drama was used to drive behavioral change around land use practices and addressing social inequities and gender, and what behavioral changes you observed?
Thanks for that question. So yes, we have used a lot of drama and theater in our work in Malawi. And this may not work in all contexts, but we found where they act out different situations and then discuss it afterwards. We used it very explicitly in a curriculum that we developed, and we did it in collaboration with a humanities professor whose area of expertise in Malawi. He's a Malawian humanities professor, is using theater for this kind of communication tool. But even before we did that formal development of a curriculum, we used drama a lot. It allows for kind of presentation of difficult ideas, whether it's gender inequity or changing farming practices, in a way that brings in humor and is very engaging. And then if you can do a drama and then have a discussion afterwards, it can be really provocative and interesting and stick with people. So we found that strategy was, we tested this curriculum with, I want to say 500 households, different study. And we found that there was a significant improvement in food security and dietary diversity and other sustainable land management practices following a 3-year. So we did the curriculum, and then we followed them over 3 years and found a significant improvement. So I think it's something that can be done here in the United States as well. And I've seen drama be used right at Cornell in really interesting ways. So I think it's an underutilized tool. Better than PowerPoints.
Again, one of the things that caught my attention was the extent to which your use of drama was able to explore gender dynamics and how important the empowerment of women to strengthening climate resilience and increasing food security is. And it's a topic that came up last week when we were discussing plastic waste management in Burundi. So it's really interesting to see that theme emerge again this week.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to introduce questions around gender or other sensitive topics, because it provides a way to bring it forward without it being sort of more direct. I think it's very direct, but it feels less like you're being lectured at.
Yeah. I think it does leave more space for people to really find themselves in the conversation. So I guess the obvious question is, what's next for you and your research?
Well, yeah, I'm in the middle of working on a proposal to try to get funding to do sort of larger scale climate change adaptation in Malawi. I'm doing several research projects at the moment that are kind of finishing up, one around looking at the impacts on biodiversity from sort of large scale, landscape scale use of agroecology practices, and another working on sort of developing a forest inventory and doing some natural forest regeneration. But these are at small scales. So I mean, it's always the challenge of getting funding to do things at a larger scale, but I'm digging into more efforts at enhancing kind of climate change adaptation, trying to build on what I learned from that IPCC report and applying it in greater depth in Malawi and Tanzania, if I can get the money.
Details. And then the other question I had was, to what extent does your work involve undergraduates, and given that your exposure to these issues as an undergraduate was so critical to the way that your career unfolded?
Yeah, I've involved undergraduates for many years. Sometimes they work as research assistants. Sometimes they do undergraduate thesis projects. At the moment, I have 3 community assistants who are helping with Friends of SFHC. So they're kind of volunteering, well, not volunteering, they're being paid as interns with the organization I collaborate with in Malawi. And so I really like that aspect of Cornell, that there are many different ways you can involve undergraduates. Starting in a year from now, I'm going to do a course where I bring 10 or more undergraduates to Malawi for an intensive course on agroecology, if it goes well, if I can get interest. So yeah, I think that's a nice aspect of Cornell, is that there are opportunities and interest in involving undergraduates in various ways. I just took 3 undergraduates to Malawi in January.
Wow.
So yeah.
That must have been eye-opening for them.
It was, yes. And there's a program at Cornell for the summer, and that is the CAL's Global Fellows Program. And I've had undergraduates go to Malawi every summer. We don't have one this summer, but many summers, going for an extended period of time to work with the organization I collaborate with, because they now have a farmer research and training center. So it's kind of logistically possible for people to be based there.
Yeah. What about deploying drama in your undergraduate courses?
I have done it. They're very skeptical. I have to work at it. I'm to be, they think I'm treating them like a child initially, some of them, but I have used drama. Yes, in my class.
Yeah, it wasn't drama, but I found using role plays was very useful. Excuse me, I've got a call here from Anna Kellis's office. So,
well, David, I see your hand. So,
hi, Rachel. I was just going to ask you to talk a little more about one of the things you emphasized, let me start with one of the things you really emphasized was sort of the system interdependencies and need for holistic thinking. So within that context, as you know better than I, there's been climate change induced flooding that's been quite serious over the past couple of years in Malawi. And I wonder if you could kind of talk about the implications of that kind of risk for farmer response to that risk and the kinds of agroecological systems that you're working with.
Such a good question. It is something that's very close to home. People have been very, very heavily affected by flooding. And I think in the past, I probably thought much more about drought, I must confess, but severe flooding is another increased risk under climate change in a place like Malawi. And of course, here in New York, that's another challenge. So that really requires kind of more landscape scale planning, looking at where there's been heavy deforestation. Can there be forest regeneration in that area? Are there areas where you need to have sort of soil rehabilitation, places where you have to physically build things? We visited, when I was there in this past winter, we visited a farmer who had planted many banana trees in a former gully and then some land formation to try to prevent erosion and flooding in that area. But of course, if it's big enough flooding, that's not adequate. So another thing that we're hoping to be able to do is have a sort of a warning system that is accessible to farmers and usable by farmers using mobile phone technology, but that makes sense to them, and that is recognizing gender inequities in terms of access to information in case of severe flooding, so that people know to leave. because yeah, that system really isn't in place very effectively in Malawi, which you saw with the number of deaths with the severe tropical storm this past year. So some combination of planning for the worst while trying to do landscape level changes at the kind of regional level for trying to prevent as well.
Sounds good.
Thanks. That sounds like a lesson that translates into many other kinds of contexts, although the specifics would vary.
So, Rachel, my apologies. Needed to resolve a technical issue with Anna, and we've solved that problem, and she's here with us. But so we do need to wrap up, but just want to thank you for taking the time. I mean, I know your schedule is just jam-packed, and really appreciate your being here with this morning and helping us really further our understanding of the local food system and its interplay with the global food system, and broadening our perspective in that way. Just so critical that we continue to pay attention to these issues.
Thanks so much, Peter. I'm really honored to be invited, and great to see you all. And hi